I'd like to begin by answering a simple question. What is corporate law? Sure, I could tell you it's the branch of law that deals with the formation and governance of corporations, but I feel like that doesn't really capture the essence of what corporate law is. And believe it or not, it's not just about getting rich guys in suits more money. What corporate law really is about problem solving. It's about seeing where you are, seeing where you want to be, and charting a legal path of action that will get you there most efficiently. So I started off this year when I was just a young ISM, no experience, with my informational interviews. And these were interviews that I went on with professionals who are actually in the field. So I went on 5 of these just to learn more about the field and what it's like to work in it. My first one was with Mr. Joe Hancock, who works as Vice President and General Legal Counsel at High Ground Advisors. One of the most important things he stressed to me during this interview was the importance of developing your technical skills before you start working as a lawyer, and especially before you enter law school. So that would be things like reading, writing, critical analysis. He said all of those are crucial to working as a lawyer. My next interview was with Mr. Michael Piper, who works as an intellectual property attorney at Conley Rose PC. So as an IP attorney, he obviously focuses solely on IP law. So with him, I learned a lot about the different types of areas within IP law and how he applies that to his clients. So for example, I learned about trademarks, patents, copyrights, and when he might advise his clients to get one of those for a certain thing they're working on, or whatever that might be, which would serve their interests the best. My next interview was with Mr. Robert Johnston, who owns and runs his own private law firm. And the interesting thing about Mr. Johnston is that he's held a lot of different types of jobs as a corporate lawyer. So right now he owns his own private law firm, but he used to work for big corporations, small corporations, big and small law firms as well. So listening to him talk about all those different types of experiences was really cool, because I got to see the differences and similarities between each of those work environments. Next, I interviewed Mr. Kevin Vela, who's the founding and managing partner of Velawood PC. And something that really impressed me about him was just this go-getter attitude that he had. He was, from the moment I started talking to him in our interview, I could tell that he just wanted to get things done. He had a very good work ethic. And he started this law firm actually right out of law school, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do. So I figured that that would be a really good thing for me to take from him, was that mindset of just working hard all the time, getting what you want. And my final interview was with Mr. Jeffrey Chapman, who is a partner at Gibson Dunn PC, and he focuses solely on mergers and acquisitions work. So I learned a lot about that, domestically and internationally is what he does with different clients. And the cool thing about him is that he went to Harvard Law School, which, as most of you probably know, that's one of the top, if not the top, law schools in the country. So it was really cool hearing about that experience from him, and obviously I'd love to be there one day. That was pretty cool, just hearing him talk about that whole experience. So I paired these informational interviews with research as well, into various areas of corporate law, to supplement my first-hand research with second-hand research assessments. And some types of areas I included were mergers and acquisitions after my interview with Mr. Chapman, as I wanted to learn more about that. Contract law, trials, things like that, just a wide area of topics within corporate law, so I could learn more about the field overall. All of this, the interviews and the research, led up to my first big project, the first semester project, which was the original work. Now at first, I was a little stumped about what to do for this project, because it was a big deal. But I took a step back and I said, okay, well, let's not think about what I want to do with this project, but what I want to accomplish with it. And I had 2 main goals. So the first one was to build skills, my own skills, and build a foundation for a future in corporate law. And the next goal was to encompass multiple areas of my research throughout the first semester so that I could review that and I could stay on top of that. So in the end, I realized that in college, a lot of times in law school, you do these things called case briefings, which is you study a case, all the different information of the case, and you write about it. So I decided to do a case study for my original work. Now, I figured I came up with a 4-step process to accomplishing this. And the first step was to study different case briefings. I did that so that I would know what kind of information goes in each case briefing. So a lot of different landmark cases, I studied the case briefings of those, just so I knew which information to include. The second step was to research various landmark business law cases, not the briefings, but the cases themselves. And I did that because I needed to choose one to actually brief, and I wanted to make sure to choose one which covered a lot of different areas of my research. The third step was to further research the one I choose, just so I can know all the facts of the case, the background, the information, what was the question at hand, and then fourth, finally, was write the briefing with all the required information that you need. So I did the first two steps, and the first step, sorry. I figured that there's 5 main parts to case briefing. There's the background, which is the background of the case, obviously. The facts, which is the indisputable hard evidence, what happened here. No two sides to that. Third was the issue, which is a 1-sentence question, which is answered by the decision, by the judge's ruling. And finally, the fourth is precedence, which is for previous legal cases in which the decisions would have an impact on this case. So eventually, I settled on Sinclair Oil Corporation versus Levian as my case to write a briefing on for my original work. I chose it because, as I said before, it covers a lot of different areas of my research, like mergers and acquisitions, contracts and trials, and a couple others. So just here's some background and facts of the case, which were the first 2 steps of the case briefing, like I said. So Sinven was established as a subsidiary of Sinclair Oil Corporation. So it's an extension of the parent company, which was Sinclair. However, Sinclair took more money from Sinven over a 10-year period than Sinven had actually garnered, or the revenue that they had made. So obviously, something's wrong here. Francis Levian, who was a shareholder of Sinven, sued Sinclair for a breach of contract and a duty of loyalty. And the breach of contract was that they weren't getting enough shipments in order for the money they were paying back. And a fiduciary duty of loyalty is the duty that a parent company has, or the shareholders of the parent company have, to always act in the best interests of the subsidiary no matter what, even if it's against their own personal interests. And he felt that Sinclair was not doing that when they took more money, too much money from Sinven. And eventually the Delaware trial court sided with Levian on both parts. And I learned a lot from this original work. Mainly, I built the skills of how to study cases. As I said before, this is very important in law school and even throughout your career as a lawyer. Always analyzing these cases and knowing what to draw from them, knowing what information is still relevant today. I also improved my research skills when I researched the case briefing and Sinclair Oil Corp versus Levian specifically. This also helped my legal writing skills when I was actually writing that case briefing. All the information I had to concisely summarize in a way that made sense. And finally, just my general legal knowledge about those concepts I was talking about earlier, like duty of loyalty, breach of contract, all of those I learned a little more about. So finally, at the beginning of the second semester, I got my mentor. And it was actually the first person I interviewed, Mr. Joe Hancock, again, a VP and General Counsel at High Ground Advisors. And throughout the second semester, I went on mentor visits, and I'd like to share some of those experiences. So one of them, I went to court with Mr. Hancock and one of his assistant attorneys. It was a probate hearing, in which they were establishing a will as legitimate and establishing themselves, their company, High Ground Advisors, as legitimate executors of that will. Another time, he let me sit in on the company board meeting, which I got to see how he fits in within the company and what his role is. So I got a lot of experience going on mentor visits with Mr. Hancock in the second semester. And it all built up to my final product, which is the big ISM project for the year. Like I was with the original work, I did not know what to do for this. But again, I thought about it. I stepped back. What are my goals? So I decided my goals were that I wanted to capture my mentor experience this year with Mr. Hancock. But I also wanted to do something that was more helpful to the real world than I had done for my original work, which was kind of for me and my skills and knowledge. So part one of my final product, I decided, was to analyze the role of general counsel in a corporation. Me and Mr. Hancock had talked a lot about this over the course of the year, how he fits in within High Ground, and especially when I went to see the board meeting, I kind of saw the kind of things that he gives input to the company for, and just what his role is in general. So that was part one of my product. And I found that just through talking to Mr. Hancock and observing him, there's three main categories of work that he does. There's internal company work, which any in-house counsel for a company will do this. So for example, it might be negotiating contracts with employees, helping with that, helping HR with problems that they have with employees, and things of that nature, just within the company, corporate governance, making sure it runs smoothly. The second category was client work, so maybe it's about contracts with clients, or just helping them with whatever they might need, because High Ground Advisors manages the assets of other companies, and in doing so, they get a lot of clients, so that relationship needs to be negotiated somehow. And the third and final category of work that Mr. Hancock did was continuing legal education, which is something that all lawyers need to do to retain their legal license every year. You have to go to different areas, go to different lectures and speeches and listen to that every year so that you can keep the license and just learn more about what's happening in the legal world. So the first category, internal work, there were 5 main sections of that Mr. Hancock works on. So corporate governance and formalities is the first one. So that might be making sure that the company is doing everything properly according to their foundational documents, such as the Articles of Incorporation and especially the bylaws, which are more what handle and govern the day-to-day actions of the company. The second one is transparency and record keeping. And right now, High Ground is actually going through a process where they're changing all of their paper records and digitalizing it. And they're using an outside firm to do that. But where the legal department comes in this is that they are the ones who decide how long certain documents are kept and why they need to be kept. So that's where he came in on the record keeping part. The third one is contractual review. So like I was saying, with employees, especially within High Ground, he was reviewing those and making sure that everything was okay with them, their relationships. The fourth is collaboration between departments. And I talked about sitting in on the board meeting earlier, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about collaboration between departments. Just the legal department has a vision, but High Ground as a company also has a vision of where they want to be. And so it's how do you balance the legal vision, which is especially avoiding risk, with the High Ground overall, which might be a little more willing to take risks if it means growing as a company, growing in influence, that sort of thing. And finally, drafting documents for the company. So the example of this that I got to see with Mr. Hancock was the employee handbook. And it seems like a simple thing, but some of the language that they have to use is very specific, so that in case an employee decides to go rogue or something and sue High Ground for whatever reason, and they can't point to something in the handbook and say, look, it says here that I'm right. It doesn't say specifically that I can't do this or something. So that's especially important, just making sure all those loopholes are closed, making sure the company does not have liability for that sort of thing. And they also use the help of outside counsel for that, which specifically works in employment law. It's such a big issue. The next part of that part one was client work. So the initial process of meeting with clients, for High Ground, it was more, they're a bigger company, so the clients usually come to them, and then they tell them what their needs are. That goes with understanding their needs. And based on that, High Ground gives them advice, maybe makes a contract with them to continue working with them for however long. Giving advice. Mr. Hancock actually said that when he works with clients, that's the most important thing that he does, is give them advice. So it might just be calling him up randomly and saying, I'm having this issue, what do you think I should do about it? It might not be scheduled meetings or things like that, which you might think of when you think of a client meeting. Giving advice, he said, was the most important part of the client relationship. And finally, going to court. Now, a lot of people think of law and lawyers, and that's what they think of court. Mr. Hancock rarely actually does that, except for the probate hearings, which I was telling you about. But it is still a part of his job, and so it is something I included in my final product. And finally, continuing legal education. So this is mainly so that you can monitor changes in the law as a lawyer. So you're always knowing what's going on in your field of work. The second one is requirements for that, so you have to have 15 hours of listening to those lectures. And then you can also give speeches just to refresh your knowledge in that area and gain some of that. Part 2 of my final product. This was the big, this was kind of the bigger part of the product. As I said before, I wanted to make something that could help the world, real world, a little more and be more influential in that. So part 2 of my product was a legal handbook to creating and maintaining a corporation. So it was basically a step-by-step guide of how to make your own company a self-help, a startup kit for a company, basically. So I started off by, there's some crucial decisions you have to make about the type of corporation you want to be. So choosing a type of entity, that's a C corporation, an S corporation, limited liability company, a general partnership, limited partnership. There's a lot of different types, but you have to consider the benefits and disadvantages of each of those, such as the taxation considerations, different levels of taxation and how many levels you get taxed on, liability for the owners and the partners. So limited liability would be if one owner does something, then the other ones are not liable for it, but general liability is where all of them can be considered liable. So it's just weighing the pros and cons of each of those when choosing the type of entity. The next decision that I included in my final product was choosing a state of incorporation. So that's any of the 50 states in the US plus Washington, D.C. They all have different laws, business laws, governing how you can do business. So choosing the right state is crucial to success as a business. Delaware is one of the most common because of its business-friendly laws, and you can establish in any state, no matter what state you're currently in. So a Texas company could be Delaware, Wyoming, whatever they want. And finally, choosing a name. It's a pretty simple thing, you would think, but there's a lot of intellectual property analysis that goes with that. So making sure that you're not stealing someone's name or it's not similar to someone else's name, that's especially important to choosing. The next part of that part of my final product, of the handbook, was drafting formational documents. So the articles of incorporation are the main governing documents of your company, and in that you include how you're going to do business, what the structure of the company is like, the management structure with the owners and the people under the owners and the committees that they make. The next one is the corporation bylaws, which is more specific to the day-to-day work of the corporation. It more governs how different branches are going to relate or interact with each other, things of that nature. For both of these, I included template documents in the handbook because I felt that just listing out what the articles of incorporation and bylaws do isn't helpful enough for someone who wants to start their own company. So if you include documents, I felt that streamlined it, made it more efficient for them too. And finally, you have to file your articles with the Secretary of State in whatever state you incorporate in to make sure that they recognize you as a corporation. Some final steps for that are planning and holding the first board of directors meeting. They make some basic decisions in that, such as approving the annual resolutions, and it's more of a administrative thing just so you can say that you've done it and that you're officially a corporation now. You have to gather your supplies for the corporation, whether that's a minute book so that you can always keep minutes. And that goes back to the idea of liability, where if someone sues you and says that as a company they're not doing this, you can look in the minute book and point at a time in the meeting where you specifically said, well, we are doing this. So that's why that is especially important. A stock ledger, which every corporation needs to have, as they all have stocks. That's just to keep track of selling and buying stocks. And a corporate seal, which needs to be approved, which is an image or a logo representing the company. As I mentioned, you have to record the minutes for the reasons, for liability reasons, and I also included a template document for the minutes as well. And a few more final steps: applying for a FEIN, or a Federal Employer Identification Number, which is used by the IRS, the federal IRS, as a tax ID number and also as another way of identifying your corporation specifically. Finally, you have to think about applying for special licenses and permits within the company or for your company, because places like food, restaurants working in the food industry, or if you're working in the health industry, personal health, like a gym or something, you have to pass certain tests. For example, the restaurants would have to pass health examinations, things like that. So you have to get those licenses and permits before you can officially start operating. And finally, you have to pass the annual resolutions, which is, as you might guess, once a year. I'm just saying that this is what we want to do as a company, this is our vision, this is the major things that we did or what we're planning to do. And I included a template for that as well. So the significance of this final product, I kind of touched on it before. It helps understand the career path and the job of a corporate lawyer more. And that's especially for part one, which was the analysis of the role of general counsel in a corporation. I basically listed out everything that they do, not everything, but the major things that they do. That helps understand their job. Knowledge of business law and corporations. That's part two is where that kind of came in, because knowing how they're structured with the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, things like that. That was where it came in. And finally, part three, it was helpful for entrepreneurs and startups. So the legal handbook, I talked about this before, but as an entrepreneur, if you have an idea, but you don't really have legal knowledge, it's going to be hard to start a company. You might have to get a lawyer, and that can be expensive, and it's not efficient. So the handbook is hopefully something you can open up with an idea, and by the end of it, you'll have a company. So why I took ISM? Well, there's three main reasons. A better understanding of the professional world and the legal world in general. I feel like I really got that with events like interviewing professionals in the first semester. I got to learn a lot about what they do in the legal environment, how they work, and professional. So events like the ISM Business Symposium, where we just interacted with professionals in various fields, got to learn more about resumes, interview skills, things like that. It really helped build those up. Networking, getting to know a lot of people in a lot of different fields, and especially lawyers. That goes along with the business symposium and the interviews. I got to do a lot of that as well, just getting to know people. And finally, general legal knowledge, which first semester especially, all those research assessments that I was talking about, for talking to people with the interviews, the original work, and finally researching for my final product. All of that helped me learn more and more about corporate law. And so I think taking ISM was a really good choice. So my ISM journey, there were a lot of times where I felt like it's so much work, I don't know if I can do this, but eventually there was a moment or something that happened which made me realize that it's worth it. For example, getting my mentor, Mr. Hancock, that was a really big moment for me in the year, as it was kind of like my whole work in the first semester was coming to fruition, and I would actually get experience working with a professional in the field. So there were a lot of moments, ups and downs in the ISM journey, but it was a really rewarding one in the end. I got a lot of experience and I learned a lot, and I'm very thankful for it. I'd like to just finish off by leaving you guys with a quote. "The ladder of success is never crowded at the top," by Napoleon Hill. And it seems kind of ominous, a little at first. But what I'm taking it to mean is that if you keep working, just working hard, pushing through the tough areas like I had to do sometimes in ISM this year, and just keep working. Becoming a lawyer is a lot of work with the undergrad and then the going to law school and things like that. It's a lot of work, but if you just keep pushing through, if you keep climbing up that ladder, you'll eventually get to the success at the top.